Ben's hands worked the well rope in darkness, the rhythm steady as his heartbeat. The sky hung heavy and gray above his homestead, dawn still an hour away. He treasured these quiet moments before his children woke and their needs began. The well stood at the center of his small property, weathered wood darkened by years of use. Behind him, the cabin hunched against the spring cold, its patched roof testament to winters survived alone. He was a lonely, poor father, stripped to essentials after his wife died 3 years back. The rope burned familiar grooves into his calloused palms. He watched the empty trail that passed his land, remembering when it held promise, when travelers meant opportunity, not just dust settling after they passed. Now the trail brought nothing but reminders of his isolation. Sarah and Tom slept inside, their breathing the only company he kept most days. At 8 and 6, they carried their mother's memory in gestures Ben couldn't bear to correct. Sarah tended the forgotten garden plot each spring. Tom asked questions about Mama's favorite songs. Ben lifted the bucket, water sloshing cold over the rim. He set it aside and prepared to draw another. The eastern horizon showed the first pale hint of light, gray shifting toward silver. Movement caught his eye. A figure appeared on the trail, struggling with empty buckets that swung awkward at her sides. A woman, her silhouette uncertain against the rising sun. She walked like someone unaccustomed to the weight she carried, shoulders hunched forward, steps hesitant on the uneven ground. Ben straightened, watching her approach. Visitors were rare. Women traveling alone were rarer still. She stopped at the edge of his property, standing where the trail met his worn path to the well. Her dress suggested town origins, clean but simple. Her face remained shadowed in the pre-dawn light, but her posture spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "Mister," she called, voice soft. "Might I trouble you for water?" Ben studied her a moment. Her hands gripped the bucket handles wrong, palms flat instead of curled, hands that had never carried weight before. "Well's here for whoever needs it," he said. She walked forward slowly, like someone testing unfamiliar ground. When she reached the well, dawn light caught her face, young, maybe 25. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Mud caked the hem of her dress. "Thank you," she said. Ben filled her buckets without speaking. When he lifted them to hand them over, she reached for them too quickly. Water sloshed over the rims, soaking her sleeves. She gasped at the cold but held on, knuckles white with effort. "Obliged," she managed. He watched her walk away, buckets swaying dangerously. Water splashed with each step, leaving a dark trail on the dirt path. She disappeared down the trail, shoulders trembling under the weight. Ben returned to his own work. But his mind stayed on the woman, on her soft hands and uncertain grip, on the desperation he recognized in the set of her jaw. The sun broke the horizon, painting the sky pale gold. At chai, his children would wake soon, needing breakfast and attention. Another day of survival stretched ahead. But something had shifted. The trail no longer felt quite so empty. Rachel returned the next morning at dawn, and the morning after that. By the fourth day, Ben recognized the pattern. She arrived as light broke, asked permission though he'd already granted it, filled her buckets with shaking hands. Each day her grip improved slightly. Each day she stayed a moment longer. His children noticed. Sarah pressed her face to the window one morning, breath fogging the glass. "Papa, who's that lady's son? Someone who needs water." Ben said, "Ah, why does she keep coming back?" Tom asked, climbing onto a stool to see better. Ben had no answer. The woman never spoke beyond polite gratitude, never explained where she came from or why she traveled this trail each dawn. But her hands told stories. Her mouth wouldn't. Blisters forming, breaking, forming again, palms reddening from rope burn. She was teaching herself through pain and repetition, the hard way the frontier demanded from everyone. On the 5th morning, disaster struck. Rachel reached for the filled bucket too eagerly. Her grip slipped on the wet handle. The bucket tipped, water cascading over her skirt and boots. She stumbled backward, landing hard in the spring mud that never quite dried this time of year. For a long moment, she sat there. Her shoulders shook, though she made no sound. Water soaked through her dress. Mud caked her hands and sleeves. Ben saw himself in that moment of defeat, remembered standing in his own yard 3 years back, holding his wife's garden tools, not knowing how to continue alone, the moment when you realize your old skills won't sustain your new life. He made a decision. "Let me teach you," he said quietly. Rachel looked up, surprise breaking through exhaustion. "What?" "How to carry water proper." Ben gestured at the buckets, the yoke leaning against the well. "How to manage the weight. Build strength gradual instead of hurting yourself daily." She stared at him like he'd offered her gold instead of instruction. Why would you do that?" "Because I've watched you struggle for 5 mornings. He extended his hand to help her up. And because the frontier's hard enough without learning everything the painful way." Rachel took his hand. Her grip was weak, fingers soft against his calloused palm. When she stood, mud clung to her dress, and dignity flickered, uncertain, in her eyes. "I came west unprepared," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Most folks do." Ben said, "That's not shame. Refusing to learn is—" She looked at the well, at the trail behind her, at his modest cabin. Making some internal calculation Ben couldn't read. "I don't have money to pay for lessons." "Didn't ask for money?" Ben picked up one of her fallen buckets. "Just asked if you wanted to learn." "When is she asked?" "Tomorrow dawn." Rachel nodded slowly. Something shifted in her posture, spine straightening despite the mud and exhaustion. "I'll be here." She gathered her buckets and walked away, leaving dark footprints in the wet earth. But this time, she walked different. Not defeated, determined. That evening, Sarah asked the question that hung in the cabin like prayer. Will she stay?" "Pop." Ben looked at his daughter's hopeful face, saw his son watching him with the same unspoken longing for something beyond their isolated days. "Don't know yet," he said honestly. "But maybe." Rachel arrived the next morning before the sun cleared the horizon. Nikshori. She wore different clothes, hair tied back practical. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the well. "Where do we start?" she asked. Ben picked up the water yoke, worn smooth by years of use. "Here, balance is everything." He demonstrated the proper stance, how to position the yoke across shoulders, where weight should settle. Rachel watched intently, eyes tracking each movement. When he handed her the yoke, she positioned it carefully, adjusting until it felt right. "The frontier don't care about your past," Ben said. "Only your willingness to learn what it takes to survive." Rachel's jaw tightened. "I have a past that would concern most people." "Most people ain't teaching you to carry water at dawn." And she smiled faintly at that. "I suppose not. They worked through the basics." Ben showed her how to attach buckets, distribute weight evenly, walk with steady rhythm instead of fighting the load. His instruction was patient, his corrections gentle. Years of teaching his children had prepared him for this. After an hour, Rachel set down the yoke breathing hard. Sweat dampened her hairline despite the morning chill. "This is harder than it looks," she said. "Everything worth doing is—" Ben refilled the buckets. "But your body learns even when your mind doubts. Give it time." Rachel studied her palms, already showing the first signs of new blisters. "I fled St. Louis 6 weeks ago. Broke an engagement very publicly. Created a scandal that followed me to 3 different towns before I came here. Your ball was thigh." She said it like confession, like warning. Waiting for Ben to withdraw his offer. "And now you're learning to carry water." Ben said simply, "That doesn't bother you. My history's just weight you carried before." He gestured at the yoke. What matters is what you're willing to carry now." Rachel blinked rapidly, emotions crossing her face too quick to name. "Why are you being kind to me?" Ben was quiet a moment, choosing words carefully. "My wife died 3 years back. Left me with 2 children, and no idea how to be both parents at once. Neighbors helped some, but mostly I learned through doing. Through failing and trying again." He met her eyes. "Kindness is just passing forward what kept me alive. Your children," Rachel said, "they need more than I can. They need to see their father being decent to folks who need help." And Ben picked up his own buckets. "That's lesson enough." Rachel nodded slowly. "Processing this, what if I can't learn fast enough? What if I fail? Then you try again tomorrow." The simplicity of it seemed to settle something in her. She straightened. Decision made in the set of her shoulders. Tomorrow. Then. Dawn. Ben agreed. That evening, he told Sarah and Tom about the arrangement. His daughter's face lit with immediate hope. "Will she stay?" "Papa," Sarah asked. Ben looked at his children, seeing their loneliness reflected in eager eyes, seeing the gap his wife's death had left, that he couldn't fill alone. "Don't know yet," he said, "but we'll do our best to make her want to." Tom nodded seriously, already planning how to help. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Ben had seen from her in months. Outside, darkness settled over the homestead, but inside the cabin, something like hope flickered warm against the coming night. Training began in earnest at dawn the next day. Ben demonstrated water yoke technique while Rachel watched, mimicking his movements. Balance point, steady breathing, core strength engaging with each step. Her first attempts were clumsy. Water sloshed over bucket rims, soaking the ground. The yoke dug into her shoulders, leaving red marks through her dress. Frustration built in the tight line of her mouth. "Again," Ben said gently. Rachel reset. Tried once more. Water still spilled. Her breathing came harsh and uneven. Again. By the 10th attempt, tears of frustration streaked her cheeks. "I can't do this!" "And you are doing it," Ben corrected. "Just not perfectly yet. There's a difference." Tom appeared from the cabin, carrying his own small yoke that Ben had built years ago. The boy demonstrated his technique, bucket-sized for child hands swinging steady. "See?" Tom said proudly. "If I can do it, you can too." Rachel laughed despite her frustration. The sound surprised and genuine. "You make it look easy." "Edwina sure." "Papa says everything's hard till it's easy," Tom explained with 6-year-old wisdom. Sarah emerged next, carrying a cushioned cloth. "For your shoulders," she offered shyly. Mama used to use one when she first learned. The mention of his dead wife should have hurt, but Ben felt only warmth at his daughter's generosity. Rachel took the cloth with visible gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah," the girl beamed, then settled on the cabin steps to watch. Tom joined her, and together they became an audience and cheering section combined. The week progressed in incremental victories. Rachel's blisters broke and reformed, then gradually hardened into calluses. Her shoulders stopped aching quite so fiercely. Her grip grew confident on the bucket handles. Each morning she arrived earlier, stayed longer. Small talk emerged between repetitions. She shared pieces of her past St. Louis theaters, busy streets, a life that felt distant as dreamed now. Ben shared less verbally but more practically, teaching through demonstration and quiet patience. "The frontier don't care what you were," he said one morning, watching her carry full buckets without spilling, "only what you're willing to become." Rachel set down her load, examining her transformed hands. Calluses had begun to form along her palms. Her arms showed new muscle definition. "I'm becoming someone I don't recognize," she said. "And good." Ben replied, "The woman who couldn't carry water couldn't survive here. The woman you're becoming can." By week's end, Rachel carried full buckets across the yard without stopping, without spilling, without the desperate concentration that marked her early attempts. She set them down gently and turned to Ben, face flushed with exertion and something deeper. Pride. Maybe, or hope. "I did it," she said, voice full of wonder. "You did." Ben agreed. Sarah and Tom erupted in cheers from their watching post. Rachel laughed, genuine and surprised, then swept Tom into a hug when he ran to congratulate her. Sarah joined, and for a moment they formed a knot of celebration that Ben watched with something aching in his chest. His family, growing beyond its broken borders. That evening, Rachel stayed for the first time when Ben invited her. They ate simple fare beans and cornbread, but the meal felt rich with something more than food. Conversation flowed easy. The children chattered about their day, including Rachel and their stories, like she'd always been there. After supper, Rachel helped Sarah with reading while Tom peppered her with questions about city life. Ben watched from the fire, seeing his children's faces light with engagement he hadn't been able to spark alone. When Rachel finally left, walking the trail toward her distant boarding room, the cabin felt emptier than before. Tom looked up at his father, sleepy and content. "I like her." "Papa?" "Me too, son," Ben admitted. "Me too." Training expanded to wood chopping the next week. Yasal Samia Sharmi Haisa. Ben led Rachel to the woodpile behind the cabin, where split logs stood stacked against winter's memory. He lifted the axe, demonstrating proper stance and swing. "Safety first," he said. "Axe goes where your eyes go. Never swing angry or distracted." Rachel took the axe, testing its weight. Heavier than she expected, the handle worn smooth by years of use. She positioned herself as Ben showed, feet shoulder-width apart, grip firm but not strangled. Her first swing missed the log entirely, blade biting dirt. The second struck glancing, barely scoring the wood. Frustration flickered across her face. "Again," Ben said, his standard instruction. The children gathered kindling nearby, creating games around the work. Tom competed with himself to find the driest pieces. Sarah sorted them by size, building neat piles that showed her methodical nature. Tell us about St. Louis," Sarah called, adding to her collection. Rachel positioned for another swing. What do you want to know?" "Everything." Tom declared. Papa says cities have buildings tall as trees. Taller, Rachel said. Then brought the axe down. This time it bit true, splitting the log clean through. She gasped with surprise and delight. The children erupted in cheers. Ben allowed himself a smile, watching Rachel examine the split wood like she'd discovered gold. Did it? Aibo or cub? Tom crowed, dancing around the woodpile. Rachel's next attempts went smoother. Her body learned the rhythm, the way power flowed from core through shoulders into the downward arc. Sweat dampened her collar despite the spring coolness. Her breathing found cadence with her swings. Between logs, she shared stories. Theater performances where actors dressed in costumes more elaborate than anything the children could imagine. Streets so busy, you had to watch for carriages constantly. Shops selling goods from across the world. Why'd you leave? Sarah asked. Innocent and direct. Rachel paused mid-swing. Sometimes the place you're from isn't the place you're meant to be. Like Mama. Tom said quietly. She's not here anymore either. The casual mention froze Ben's hands on the log he was positioning. His children rarely spoke of their mother so openly, but Rachel handled it with gentle grace. Your mama sounds like she was wonderful. She said, She was. Sarah confirmed. Papa says we have her eyes. Then you're both beautiful. Rachel said simply. The afternoon stretched into evening. By the time they finished, Rachel had split half a cord of wood, her movements growing confident with each log. Her hands showed new blisters beneath the forming calluses, but she didn't complain. Stay for supper, Ben said. It wasn't a question this time. Rachel hesitated only a moment before nodding. The meal was simple, but the company rich. They ate around the rough-hewn table, passing cornbread and butter, sharing the day's small triumphs. Tom recounted every log Rachel split with exaggerated drama. Sarah showed off her organized kindling piles. After eating, they moved to the fireplace. Ben taught Rachel about coal management, draft control, how to tend flame without wasting wood. She listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest. Sarah brought her reader, settling beside Rachel on the floor. Without being asked, Rachel began helping with the difficult words, patient with Sarah's stumbling pronunciation. Tom climbed into Rachel's lap with his own picture book, and she read to him in a soft voice. They carried through the cabin. Ben watched from his chair, seeing his family whole for the first time since his wife died. Not the same as before. Different, but whole nonetheless. When Rachel finally stood to leave, full dark had settled outside. Ben walked her to the trail, carrying a lantern to light her path. Thank you, Rachel said, not just for teaching me, but for letting me be part of this. You're part of this, Ben said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Rachel smiled, touched his arm briefly, then walked into the darkness. Ben watched until her silhouette faded, then returned to his cabin where his children slept, peaceful, and his fire burned warm. That night, he admitted to himself what he'd been avoiding. Rachel had become family, not replacement for his wife, but something equally important, chosen kin, formed through patient days and shared purpose. The frontier had taken much from him, but maybe, finally, it was offering something back. The merchant arrived on a Tuesday, wagon creaking with goods for the distant trading post. Ben was teaching Rachel how to mend fence posts when the man stopped, curiosity bright in his weathered face. Morning, Ben. The merchant called. New hired hand. Friend. Ben corrected. Learning frontier skills. The merchant's wife leaned from the wagon seat, eyes sharp on Rachel. You're that woman from St. Louis. The one who ran from her wedding. Rachel's hands stilled on the fence rail. Color drained from her face. "Left my fiancé at the altar," she said quietly. Created quite the scandal. The merchant's wife sniffed. "I heard you threw wine in his face in front of the whole congregation." "He deserved it," Rachel said. Voice steady despite her pale complexion. "But that doesn't make it proper." The wagon rolled on, but damage was done. Within days, whispers spread through the scattered frontier community. Women at the trading post turned cold shoulders when Rachel appeared. "You're hot Ben." Men who'd borrowed Ben's tools suddenly found excuses not to visit. Like, one neighbor stopped by specifically to warn Ben. "That woman's trouble. Bringing shame to your homestead, and you got children to think about." "I'm thinking about them just fine," Ben replied. Voice hard. But doubt crept in during the long nights. His poverty made him vulnerable to community judgment. If neighbors withdrew help entirely, survival would grow harder, especially come winter, when shared labor made the difference between comfort and suffering. "Be so I can't buy." Sarah noticed the change first. "Why doesn't Mrs. Henderson wave anymore?" she asked after a trip to the trading post. Ben had no good answer. Rachel arrived at the well one morning with tears streaking her face. She set down her buckets carefully, then met Ben's eyes with visible effort. "I need to leave," she said. "I'm bringing you trouble you don't deserve." "That's not your decision to make." "Your neighbors hate me." "Your children." "My children love you." Ben interrupted. "They're healing because of you." Laughing again. Learning again. Rachel shook her head. "That's not enough reason to risk your standing in this community. You're already poor. Ben, you can't afford to be outcast too." He wanted to argue, wanted to promise it didn't matter what others thought. But the weight of responsibility pressed down. Heavy as any water yoke. His children needed more than his affection. They needed community support, future opportunities, acceptance in a world that judged harshly. "Let me think on it," he said finally. Rachel nodded, understanding what that meant. "I'll make it easy for you. I've arranged passage on a wagon heading west at week's end. I'll be gone before you have to choose." She gathered her buckets and left, shoulders straight despite the defeat in her voice. That evening, Tom asked why Rachel hadn't stayed for supper. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, though she wouldn't explain why. Ben sat between his children, feeling their confusion and hurt, unable to offer comfort. He didn't feel. The next morning, Rachel didn't come to the well, or the morning after that. On the third morning, Ben found a note tucked into the water bucket. Rachel's careful handwriting thanked him for his kindness, apologized for the trouble, wished his family well. She'd already left. The note explained, couldn't bear the goodbye, hoped he'd understand. Ben stood in the dawn darkness, note crumpling in his fist. Around him, the homestead felt hollow. The woodpile Rachel had helped split. The fence she'd learned to mend. The well where she'd first arrived with soft hands and desperate hope. Inside the cabin, his children slept. They'd wake soon, asking questions he couldn't answer, looking for the woman who'd brought warmth back into their grieving home. Persa. Ben looked at the eastern horizon where the sun would rise, where Rachel had appeared weeks ago, silhouette uncertain against the dawn, where she'd left again, heading toward another uncertain future. And he realized he'd already made his choice. Had made it weeks ago, the first time he heard his children laugh. The frontier taught hard lessons. But the hardest was this. Sometimes what others thought of you mattered less than what you thought of yourself. He had to find her before it was too late. Ben didn't sleep that night. He sat beside the dying fire, watching coals fade from orange to gray to ash. The cabin felt too quiet without Rachel's evening presence, too empty without her laughter mixing with his children's voices. He thought about his wife, how she'd taught him that family wasn't just blood, but choice, how the people who stayed through hardship mattered more than the ones who judged from safety. She'd chosen him despite his poverty, despite her family's disapproval, built a life from nothing but determination and love. Rachel had made the same choice, had chosen to learn instead of quit, to stay instead of run, until community pressure forced her out. Ben stood as the first gray light touched the windows. His decision was made. He woke his children gently. Need you two to stay with Mrs. Patterson today. Got important business. Hey, Mom. Is it about Rachel? Sarah asked, instantly awake. Yes. Are you bringing her back? Tom rubbed his eyes hopefully. Going to try, son. He left them with the nearest neighbor who hadn't turned cold, then rode hard toward town. Rachel's boarding house stood at the edge, weathered wood and narrow windows. Her landlady answered his knock with suspicious eyes. She left an hour ago. The woman said, wagon heading west, traveling light. Ben rode faster than was wise on the rutted trail, caught up to the wagon 3 miles out. The driver just starting his morning journey. Rachel sat in back, surrounded by bundles and crates, her face turned away from the rising sun. Rachel, Ben called. She turned, shock and hope warring across her face. The wagon stopped. Ben dismounted, approached on foot, found words that had been building all night. The frontier teaches you what matters. He said, my children matter. Teaching matters. You matter. Ben, I can't let you. Don't let other people's fear make your choices. He moved closer, voice firm. You've brought my family back to life. Trouble's a small price for that. Rachel shook her head. You don't understand what you're risking. I understand exactly. Ben pulled papers from his coat, documents he'd spent the night preparing. To see. There's a plot of land adjacent to mine, 20 acres, unclaimed. I'm helping you file for it. You'll build your own cabin, your own life, not as my dependent, but as neighbor, as family. Why? Rachel's voice broke. Why would you do this? Because my children need what you offer. Gentleness and education, and hope that life continues after loss. Ben met her eyes steadily. And because I need it too, you've reminded me that family isn't just what you're born into. It's who you choose to stand beside when things get hard. Tears streaked Rachel's face. The gossip won't stop. Let them gossip. I'd rather face judgment with you here than peace with you gone. Rachel climbed down from the wagon, landing in the dirt road, stood before Ben with mud on her hem and hope in her eyes. I won't hide anymore, she said. Won't pretend I don't have a past. Good. Ben replied. Neither will I. They shook hands formally, sealing the agreement. The wagon driver watched with bemused tolerance, then turned his team back toward town. Ben and Rachel walked beside his horse, discussing practical matters as dawn strengthened into full morning. Land claims and cabin construction, where to position the structure for best sun and water access, how to approach the loan for materials, the children's excitement when they learned she was staying. By the time they reached Ben's homestead, Sarah and Tom were racing down the path, having escaped Mrs. Patterson's supervision. They crashed into Rachel with delighted shouts, nearly knocking her over. "You came back!" Tom crowed. "Your papa convinced me," Rachel said, laughing through tears. Sarah looked up at her father with something like awe. "You really brought her home." "I did say car. What do you say stay?" "We're bringing her home together," Ben corrected. "All of us, as family." They walked to the cabin united, children chattering, adults planning, the morning sun warm on their faces. The frontier stretched vast and challenging around them, but they would face it together now. And that made all the difference. The barn raising happened 3 weeks later, modified for cabin construction. Word spread through the community despite the gossip, because frontier practicality outweighed judgment when work needed doing. Neighbors arrived grudgingly, some out of obligation, others out of curiosity about the woman who'd caused such talk. Rachel stood at the center of her future home, hammer in hand, directing log placement with quiet authority. Her hands calloused and strong now gripped tools with confidence Ben had taught her. She wore practical clothes, hair tied back, face determined. That log's twisted." She called to 2 men positioning a wall support. "Needs rotating a quarter turn." They obeyed. Surprised by her knowledge, Ben watched from the woodpile, seeing pride and capability in her every movement. She'd studied cabin construction with the same intensity she'd brought to water carrying. Ask questions, practice techniques, learned through doing. The children worked alongside adults. Tom carrying nails, Sarah organizing tools. They treated Rachel's project as their own, fierce little advocates for the woman who'd become family, Mrs. Henderson. The neighbor who'd first turned cold approached mid-morning. She watched Rachel notching logs with practiced precision, then spoke grudgingly. "You've learned well." Rachel looked up, sweat dampening her collar. "Had a good teacher. Still don't approve of what you did in St. Louis," Mrs. Henderson said. "But I suppose running from a bad situation takes its own kind of courage. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was thaw." Rachel nodded acknowledgement and returned to work. By noon, the cabin's frame stood complete. By afternoon, walls rose solid. The community worked with practiced efficiency, decades of shared labor, making them move like a single organism, despite individual reservations. As the sun angled toward evening, Sarah approached Rachel with something hidden behind her back. The girl's face showed nervous excitement. "I made you something," Sarah said shyly. She revealed a sampler, carefully embroidered with uneven stitches that showed hours of 8-year-old effort. The words read, "Family ain't always blood." Rachel's composure shattered. She knelt in the dirt, gathering Sarah into a fierce hug. Tears streaked through the dust on her face. Tom joined the embrace, and for a long moment the 3 of them formed a knot of emotion that silenced the working adults around them. Ben watched from the doorway of the half-finished cabin, seeing his children choose Rachel as surely as he had, seeing her accept that choice with gratitude and love. When Rachel finally stood, she addressed the assembled neighbors with quiet dignity. "I know most of you don't approve of me. My past isn't proper or respectable." She held the sampler against her chest. "But these children have shown me that family isn't about approval. It's about showing up, about choosing each other day after day, even when it's hard." She looked at Ben. "IDT. Their father taught me that the frontier don't care where you've been, only where you're willing to go and who you're willing to become. I'm grateful for that lesson." Silence held for a long moment. Then Mr. Peterson, the eldest farmer, spoke gruffly. "Cabin needs a roof before dark. Let's stop jawing and finish." It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was enough. They worked until sunset painted the sky orange and gold. When the last shingle was nailed, Rachel stood in her completed doorway, looking across the small distance to Ben's cabin where lamplight already glowed. 2 homes. 2 hearths. 1 family. Sarah and Tom ran between the cabins, claiming both as theirs. Rachel watched them with visible love, then walked to where Ben stood. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for staying," he replied. They watched the sunset together, comfortable in the silence around them. The frontier stretched vast and challenging. But they'd built something lasting against it, something that would endure through whatever came next. Family, formed by choice and sealed by patience. The strongest foundation of all, summer arrived with warmth and abundance. Rachel's garden flourished beside her cabin, neat rows of vegetables showing knowledge Ben had shared. Her chickens scratched in their coop, providing eggs she traded at the post. Independence, earned through patient instruction and her own determination. But each morning, she still walked to Ben's well, not from necessity now, but from ritual. This morning mirrored the first. Months ago, when she'd appeared uncertain on the trail, but everything had changed. Ben worked the well rope as dawn broke, and Rachel appeared not struggling but striding, confident in movement he'd taught her. "Morning," she called. "Morning," Ben replied. They worked the well together, their calloused hands familiar on the rope, water-filled buckets with practiced efficiency. The children emerged from Ben's cabin, racing across the yard to join them. "Rachel, Papa says we can fish today," Tom announced, "if morning chores get done." Ben clarified. Sarah carried a basket of fresh eggs from Rachel's coop. "I'd trade you for bacon." "Deal." Rachel agreed. Smiling, they moved through morning tasks with easy coordination. Rachel's garden needed watering. Ben's fence needed mending. The children needed supervising and teaching. But they tackled everything together. Shared labor making quick work of necessary chores. After breakfast, Rachel examined her hands in the morning light. Calluses had fully formed, rough patches on her palms marking each skill learned. Scars traced her knuckles from wood splinters and tool slips, evidence of transformation. Written in her own flesh. "Strange," she said. "I came here seeking water, and now you got a well of your own." Ben pointed out. "I got more than that." Rachel gestured at the 2 cabins, at the children playing between them, at the life they'd built from desperation and patience, came seeking water, found education, sought education, found family. Tom overheard, appearing at Rachel's elbow with his fishing pole. "Papa says family's who shows up. And you show up every day." Rachel ruffled his hair affectionately. "So do you, small man." They gathered supplies for the fishing expedition. A lazy summer day stretching ahead. As they walked toward the creek, Sarah took Rachel's hand naturally. Tom walked between the adults, chattering about the fish he planned to catch. Ben watched his expanded family with quiet contentment. "Et nos de balksterdis." The loneliness that had defined his life for years had lifted, replaced by this daily warmth. Rachel hadn't replaced his wife. Couldn't and didn't need to. She'd simply filled the space beside him, creating something new from shared struggle and choice. At the creek, they settled on the bank. Children cast their lines with varying success. Adults supervised and offered advice. The sun climbed higher, warming skin and spirit alike. "I was thinking," Rachel said during a quiet moment. "Maybe I could teach Sarah proper embroidery. Help Tom with his letters." "You already do that," Ben observed. I mean formally. Like you taught me formally. Rachel watched the children with visible affection. I passing it forward, like you said. They'd like that. I'd like it too. The afternoon passed in peaceful increments. Fish were caught and released. Sandwiches were eaten. Stories were shared. The kind of ordinary day that forms the backbone of family life. Unremarkable except in its comfort and continuity. As the sun angled toward evening, they walked home together. Sarah and Tom ran ahead, racing to see who could reach the cabins first. Ben and Rachel followed at a slower pace, carrying the fishing gear. Thank you, Rachel said quietly. Like, for what? For teaching me? For believing I could learn? She looked at her calloused hands. For giving me time to become who I needed to be. Thank you for learning, Ben replied. For staying even when it got hard. They reached the space between their cabins, where the path split toward separate doors. But the separation felt insignificant. They'd eat supper together shortly, probably at Ben's table. The children would play until dark. Day. Rachel would help with bedtime routines before returning to her own hearth. 2 homes, 1 family, chosen and cherished. The sun set in brilliant colors, painting the frontier landscape in gold and orange. Rachel looked at her cabin, at Ben's beside it, at the children racing between them, at the life she'd built from nothing but willingness, in the patient instruction of a lonely man who'd risked everything to help her. The frontier don't ask where you've been, she said softly, repeating the wisdom Ben had taught her. Only where you're headed, and sometimes, Ben added, voice warm. When you're blessed, you find that where you're headed leads you home. They stood together in the fading light, their hands bearing matching calluses, their hearts bearing matching peace. The well stood between their cabins, no longer a symbol of isolation but of the daily ritual that had transformed 2 broken people into a family. Tomorrow, Rachel would arrive at dawn. They would draw water together, plan the day's work, share coffee while the children woke. The routine that had begun in desperation would continue in contentment. Each day, building on the last, the frontier had tested them. They had answered with patience, courage, and the quiet determination to build something lasting. Not perfect, but real, not easy, but worthwhile. Family, in the truest sense, chosen, earned, and cherished beyond measure.